Welcome to Bloom. Be inspired to be an empowered version of yourself and create meaningful change in the world. And my guest is Nicole Lee today, and I'm really looking forward to talking to her because we had such wonderful conversations before this podcast. So let me introduce her to you. Nicole is a coach and lives in Atlanta in the United States. And the list of certifications she has is really, really long. So I'm not going to get into all of it. But I think what's important for you to know is that she's worked for 20 years as a business management consulting transformation leader and advisor for Fortune 500 companies, and then transitioned into health coaching. You're a Reiki master. You're a certified resilient heart and trauma heart math practitioner. And you have a bachelor in psychology and a master's in instructional systems. So it's a wonderful mix of somebody who's worked in consulting in the so-called real world, in psychology, and in the realm of the heart and the spirit. So let's get into some of the things that would be important for you to mention to our listeners about what you do and what's important to you.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Yole. I'm so excited to be on your podcast, and I so greatly appreciate the opportunity. I would say to add to that, I greatly appreciate that you talked about the integration of the work I do. So, most of the work and where I help support women is through life transitions, typically tied to career or romantic partnerships, or in the situation with me that became the major transition in my life was the death of my mother. And so with that work, as we can imagine, it's not one thing. It's not just the mind. It's not just the feeling. It's not just the physical body. It's all of it. And so, what I've come to find in my work is it's so important to have a holistic view of ourselves so that we can see the integrated parts that may be suffering, hurting, or in pain. So, I would just add that of leveraging not only the healing arts modalities, but the other part is because I was in change and transformation for 20 years, I take a strategic approach to it as well. So I've come to find that many of the women I work with are like, that's great. I'm feeling, I'm healing, but how do I take action? Right? Like, how do we do something with this? And so that's one of the areas that I focus on as well, is making sure that we're taking intentional action while we're on the healing journey, that we find again that there's an integration between our emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual life as it relates to how we show up in the world, what we do in our work and our relationships. So I would just add that, and hopefully that helps people get a full view of the work I do and how I show up in the world.
I like that. I like that a lot. Of course, also because it resonates with the work that I do and that
Yes.
sees all these different aspects of a human being and not just the mental plane or just the emotional plane. And I would agree with you that it's, if we really want to heal and be able to take action, which is part of what this podcast is about, we need to look at all these different planes and have them deeply integrated and deeply rooted in our own sense of self. And
Yeah. And
another thing that we share is working with trauma.
mhm.
So we decided for this podcast to concentrate on a specific topic out of all the topics that you cover,
Mhm.
and that is grief.
Mhm.
And because grief is something that is usually neglected. I mean, the other day I talked to a client in her job. She got exactly 3 days to grieve the death of her mother. And I thought our society is really ridiculous because
Yes.
that's not how it works at all. Um, and I would like to also introduce this, um, to use your word, intersection between a challenge and a trauma and
Mhm.
the options and transformation that offers for us if we really take time to integrate it and to look at what's happening. And you have a wonderful quote on your homepage, and it says, "The moments that challenge us the most are the same moments that hold the power to transform our lives and the lives of others.
Mm-hmm.
So over to you. You have a very interesting concept about the grief brain that you
Mm-hmm.
told me about. Could you tell our listeners a bit about that?
Sure. I would love to just step back too of what you were saying about how we look at grief. And I think what's beautiful about us being on other sides of the pond is what we're actually seeing is grief and how it's managed and talked about and worked through is pretty universal in it not giving the time and attention and care that it should, right?
Mm.
The same policy you're referring to happens in the US, 3 or 4 days for bereavement. And it's one of those things that I've realized that no different than say what we're doing in the movement of say menopause is that it's antiquated and there hasn't been someone who's focused to say, wait a minute, there's scientific evidence, and this is where I'm getting to with the grief brain, right? There is scientific evidence that people's bodies and minds, their brains are altered as a result of experiences of grief. And so I believe that someone hasn't necessarily done the same due diligence and pushed in the same way. And maybe that's going to be part of my advocacy to say, hey, here's the science. We need to start looking at this as the same way we do with other challenges, health challenges that you now have given family leave and things of that nature, right? I find it interesting in my situation. I was very fortunate that family medical leave to take care of my mother who was declining from cancer, but the bereavement policy was still the same, right? So I had
Mm.
time to take care of her for 4 months, but the bereavement policy was still a short window of time. So I just wanted to because I feel like people who listen to this will be like, yes, like this, there's something missing here, and it's a time for us to review this, the way we're looking at grief. But getting into the grief brain and just even what happens in the body. So when, and actually I'll step back because I think this is important as well. Oftentimes, we have connected grief to a loss of a loved one and even a pet, right? Someone who's alive, a being. But we discount all the other losses and their correlation or connection to grief. And there are over 40 different types of losses that can lead to experiences of grief. So if you think about just the life that we live, we have a lot of losses to your point that we have not really been given the time and capacity to really sit with to say, wow, I'm grieving this. And so when you look at loss of a job, when you look at a move where you lost connection to relationships or even a home that you loved, when you look at estranged relationships, whether they're friendships or family relationships, when you look at what's going on in the political landscape, particularly in the US, a loss of sense of freedom, a loss of security, a loss of hope, all of those things can lead to feeling grief. And so when we look at grief and the grief brain or even the grief body, it creates a disruption in our mind and body. We can have symptoms of things like anxiousness. I had panic attacks. I never experienced panic attacks until after my mother died,
Mm.
right? Um,
Right.
I experienced claustrophobia on planes. I am someone who's traveled over 1 million miles and couldn't understand why I could not be on a plane when it was still, right? So you have those types of things. You can have your body, you can have body aches, you can have headaches, you can have fatigue. There's a laundry list of things that can happen because your body's in a sense of between what it's lost and trying to calibrate the reality of where you are today. And so I think that's the other thing for those who are going through grief when they're like, what's happening to me? Your body's been running a program of something that feels familiar. So if we even look at a relationship, that was very familiar. Everything was going in a certain way. So your body is taught and your brain is taught to be efficient. So it learns how to operate with that. It learns the body language of someone, it learns the connection with someone, it learns the conversations you typically have. And then there's a disruption that's no longer happening. So your brain and body is almost like a computer system. It's like we're not working anymore. We need to
Mm,
reboot. And so I share that because so many people, I think that's another thing that we miss is there is literally a calibration process that your brain as body is trying to go through from what it knew to now this new thing that it has no understanding of. And so that was something that was very eye-opening for me going through my grief. For example, I used to text my mother all the time. I remember waking up, picking up my phone, and my brain automatically and body
mm,
went to texting her. And
mm.
then it came to a consciousness like, oh, she's no longer here. Right. But my brain and body was still in the rhythm of texting
Yeah.
my mother, of talking to my mother, of calling her when I was in need. So I just share that because I find that that is one area also that isn't talked about as much of like, yes, you've been used to a familiar thing and now that thing is stopped. And that's what's creating a bit of that disruption in the brain and the body.
Yeah, totally. I think you described that really, really well because we are beings of habit, right?
Yes.
And we also have the habit of having certain people in our lives and the interaction with them. And we
Yes.
also talked about the fact that grief is often misdiagnosed.
Yes.
And I can, yeah, no. And I would say that I've recently listened to somebody who talked about the grief you accumulate when you get older. So
Mm.
let's say you're in your late 50s or early 60s, there are many of your friends that might have passed because they were older than you were. Your parents might have passed. You've lost maybe opportunities you would have liked to have. Maybe your big dream about something didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow I was reflecting on depression and
Mm-hmm.
on other, like you said, anxieties that older
Mm-hmm.
people tend to get. And I think it's not just this idea, well, my life will be over soon. I think it's like you've accumulated like a debt,
Yes.
all these things that are missing. And I try to play that sort of around, in my own life. And I said, yeah, it is true. There are things that I have not taken the time to grieve
Yeah.
about, that
Yeah.
I have lost, I have not done, I couldn't take with me, or I will have to let go in the future. So what's
Yes.
your take on that?
And I love that you say that because what comes to me and where I work with clients is we never really taught to take inventory of those
Yes.
things, right? And so oftentimes, too many folks have probably heard of the trauma backpack. That's usually something that's very common to talk about all the things that you're carrying, because that's what we're talking about, carrying, right? And so what I sense and feel is that because we haven't made this part of our lifestyle to check in and take inventory of, then
Mm,
to your point, we're accumulating, whether energetically or whatever, we're literally adding to that weight, to that backpack. um and so I believe over time, we get to a threshold, and everyone's threshold is a little bit different, right? And I
right.
think that's where sometimes the midlife crisis and that language comes from. But I do think I haven't been taking inventory. And so if I haven't been taking inventory what's in my bag, then I haven't unpacked it and then I haven't released it or let it go. So I often talk about grief and trauma in the same way. What's in the bag? Have you looked in it to start to unpack things? And you and I have even talked about intergenerational elements of that, right? There are certain belief systems, there are certain traumas that have been carried over that you've already inherited in your bag that you probably haven't given some time and attention to. So, one of the things that I work with my clients, if they're comfortable and obviously just taking in, honoring where you are and how much you can do at a time, but it is an inventory or a timeline, and starting to look at some of those losses that you may not have considered, maybe tied to grief to the point we made, right? So, for example, I have a client that was going through a divorce. And when we were going through this timeline, yes, they were grieving their divorce, but when we backed up, they had already started grieving before they got married.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
They were already seeing losses connected to relationships, loss of themselves. And so when we backed it up, we could look at how intense the actual divorce was because she had not taken inventory of all the losses of identity and connection and relationships along the way.
That is so interesting. So one might even ponder whether if she or both of them had
Yeah.
taken inventory, they would never have gotten the divorce. They could have worked through it together,
Perhaps.
possibly.
Yeah, perhaps, or even again, if I'll back it up, some of the behaviors that we have that we repeat relationships because we didn't take inventory of loss of ourselves along with potentially traumatic experiences, we start to repeat it. So, this could have been a situation where she may not have married this person. Because if we back it up even further, the loss of identity, the loss of trust, the loss of safety, all these other things that had actually happened created behaviors perhaps of attaching to a person that wasn't your person.
Yes, I agree. Yes, I
Yeah.
agree. It is so fascinating, the sort of one starts looking at these things, this timelines, that's possible
Yes.
timelines that suddenly pop up, which again, even contemplating that, again involves a lot of work, because it means the choice you took
Hmm.
might not have been something that was automatic. It was only automatic for the decisions you or somebody in your ancestry had taken.
Yes. Yes. So that goes
Um,
back to that part of some of the habit, the unconscious habit, or even the unconscious familiarity, right? That again, if we aren't taking inventory, and what I would say is taking inventory out of curiosity and not judgment. So a
hmm,
lot of times what happens is, again, based on traditions or things of that nature, we're taught to, why did you do that? Why are you this way? Versus, I'm curious why I'm creating these same habits. I'm curious why that familiar thing that still doesn't serve me or has hurt me in the past, I'm curious why I still move in that direction, because something about that still feels safer than the unknown of an experience I haven't had. And so that's where I find slowing down and taking inventory and asking, finding those events and then asking in curiosity, we start to empower ourselves to see our own patterns. And then we start to empower ourselves with the language that allows us to communicate that with other people who can
hmm,
support us. Because I think this is when we were talking about misdiagnosis, because we haven't done enough self inventory, a self discovery. Oftentimes we're leaning on other people to diagnose us. We're leaning
yeah,
on other people very heavily to tell us what's wrong with us. And though when we're in co creation with other people, it's beautiful. But what I found, even in myself, the more I understood myself, the more I was able to effectively communicate, which then meant I got effective support. If I just go into a place and say, I'm having panic attacks and anxiety based on Western diagnostics or analysis, more than likely I would have been prescribed anxiety medication. Because I know that I was grieving, because I had done the research, because I knew this wasn't a habit that I had before, because I'd worked in high stress environments, I didn't do that. I went to finding holistic methods to help calibrate my body, right? So I think part of this is empowering ourselves again so that we feel that we're co-creating our experiences with people who are supporting us versus being dependent on people to diagnose us or tell us what's wrong with us. Um
yes, yes.
so
Especially this, what's wrong with us? I have this discussion with my clients so many times. It is so disempowering to think that you need to be fixed and always
yes.
fixed by somebody else, and that there's something wrong with you. For the most part, I would say the body just does what it needs to do, what it's
Yes.
programmed to do. And
Hmm.
grief is not pathological. I mean, there are
It's not.
certain forms of grief maybe that are, but in itself, it is a very natural and healthy, important thing to do. And especially if, in the context of people we loved, I mean, that is a form of respect. And,
Hmm.
that's the way I see it. So um, I would like to sort of go back one step, because I think this is, you touched on something really important. And that is when we look at our patterns, I
Mm-hmm.
find again and again that some of the patterns we carry are not our own.
Yes.
We either took part of them on from our parents,
Yes.
or they come even further down the line of our ancestry. And I just recently worked with a person from Northern Europe, and it's
Mhm.
an area where there's been a lot of war.
Okay.
And she carried um, grief from her
Mm.
great grandfather. And it
Mhm.
really started to make a difference. And it was so astonishing to her. It's like, where does that come from? I just don't compute. I don't understand.
Mhm.
But it is so, and I think you called that, if I understood that correctly, the legacy burdens.
Mm.
So it's what we carry from our ancestry that's in a way still exists around us as a
Yes.
reality, even if we only perceive that most of it in an unconscious way or reactions to it in an unconscious way. So we did talk a little bit also about the role that grief plays in the lives of women of color,
Mhm.
because it's again there's layers to it that, let's say, for a European are
Mhm.
not really relevant, but for a particular population that is something that is of huge importance, but maybe not really talked about a lot.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that as we go on these journeys, the lived experience is so important, and acknowledging our lived experiences and recognizing that there are these nuances and complexities across the intersectionality of who we are, and honoring that. I would say, as a woman of color, and recognizing not only the societal and traditional elements that are at play about how we look at grief. I would say, I'm not a scientist and fully in this space, but I do understand that certain things become wiring for our survival, right? So when we look at some of the reasons, particularly that Black and Brown people perhaps didn't grieve, didn't show emotion, didn't express themselves, were not vulnerable, were also based on the imprints of our ancestors for survival. So if your ancestor was a slave, right, and by showing emotion would be weakness or lashes or whatever the consequence was, there is wiring that can be predisposed in you not to express. Then you go into an environment, say that culture has been repeated, and you have parents that say showing your emotion is weakness. Showing that emotion around other people is a weakness. Crying is a weak, right? Like, so then you get, not only you have this ancestral imprint, now you have the cultural traditional imprint. Then you go into the world and society that reinforces some of those behaviors. So that's the compounding of that experience. And so when we talk about, particularly with grief, what I found sometimes in cultures, even sometimes in from a religious aspect, is that, you know, you just go through it, or some of the language that God will get you through, or just be strong is a huge one in the Black and Brown community. Just be strong. People are tired of being strong. People don't want to be strong all the time, right? And so I do think some of that language was, the intent is supportive, but what it does is it does have people feeling suppressed in their ability to grieve. I had a client that went to work and they told her that they're dead. So why are you still grieving? There's nothing you can do about it. Right?
It's ridiculous. I'm
Or we
sorry.
get the kind of bypassing, like, okay, they're great, but look at all the wonderful things that can happen. Or in relationships, that person was a bad guy or girl. So that just opens up for you to have a better relationship with someone else. That doesn't help when you're in the midst of grieving.
Mm.
So that's what I've experienced a lot with the women of color that I've worked with, is there has been, again, those layers, right? That happen in my ancestry. I know the history of that. I've been exposed to that, again, from a protection or safety perspective. So the thing I'd add is having the compassion for what our ancestors felt they needed to do, while also feeling empowered to change it,
Mm-hmm.
and feeling and recognizing that you can still honor your ancestors. Because another cultural thing is, if I shift it or change it or I say it's bad, then I'm disrespecting my ancestors. And what I help my clients, particularly that are Black and brown and BIPOC community, is you can still honor that and still be the cycle breaker, right? You can still honor that that was necessary, while also saying it's no longer going to be your story.
Exactly. Even, and we did talk about that, it is still anchored in the story of your everyday. Yeah, in
Mm-hmm.
the US, that's a huge topic. I mean,
Yes.
I lived in the States for about 5 years, and as a European, watching from the outside, I was like, I mean, still, it's a long time ago, but I was like, gee, I mean, it's everywhere. It's
Yeah, and our
everywhere.
media, yeah, and that's the thing, to your point, is like, particularly with, again, I can only go from my lived experience, the way the media constantly perpetuates the inferiority, the lack, the weakness, some of these underlying subconscious messages that also create this resistance or fear to fully express ourselves. And though we were talking about grief, it's across the board, right? And so, again, if we have that externally, but also we're dealing with internal relationships, or relationships that are in our close ecosystem, that becomes a lot of stress and pressure to liberate yourself or find those who will support you in liberating yourself. Um, and I do think that's what, with any conversation we have, is recognizing the layers, right? So again, taking inventory of what are those messages that have come through you, but also what messages you may not be recognizing that you're consuming, that are reinforcing that. So I always invite folks to take a step back and be more present about what you're listening to, who you're speaking with, what you're reading, right? Because if you already have those imprints and then you're reinforcing it, it becomes even more difficult to free yourself from, right, that program basically that's been running.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. And I will always be eternally grateful to my great grandmother,
Mm.
who 100 years ago actually fought for women's rights. I mean, she
Wow.
did tons of other things that, did harm to the family, but she was, I mean, she married 4 times, a figure at
Okay.
that time,
Mm-hmm.
and she just did what she wanted. But she also tied that into a broader context of saying women have the same value as men do. And that 100 years ago was very gutsy to say
Yes.
and to live. But it's reached
It's
me, it's
still
reached my
gutsy. I don't mean to
daughter.
cut you off, but it's still gutsy. That's what's pretty
Yes, it is.
sad, is it's still gutsy.
It is still gutsy, but not quite as gutsy as 100 years ago, and
Yeah.
or more than 100 years ago, actually. And it's created a lineage of strong women because we
Mm,
had the permission
mm.
to do that. So we just never know what ripple effect our decisions will have on future generations or people's whose lives we touch by having freed ourselves of um, what's the English word for that, for certain instructions that
Yeah.
still exist in our society.
Yeah. And what I love, what you also shared about her, is that one thing that always comes to me, it's not either or, it's not absolute. And many times we've been taught that it's literally, black and white, right? And many of these things, it's pulling the things forward that still do serve us. So just like you said, there might have been other things, but I get to choose what I pull forward or what I learn from that. So even if, for example, with emotions or expressing grief or working through that, if I understand that, yes, that was for survival, then how do I look at what parts of that still serve me? I'm
Mm.
going to be discerning about where I'm vulnerable. I'm going to be discerning about where I share my grief. I'm going to take on that part of the ownership because it's still important for my survival and being able to thrive, right? So I think sometimes, and I love what you shared about this, we don't look at the full picture of our ancestors and the full story, and making sure that we are looking at the wisdom that we want to carry forward, while also honoring, like you just said, that we can be the trailblazers, or we can be the ones that shift those things that perhaps, where I was going with this too, is that they couldn't.
Mm.
Right? So I think sometimes we forget that certain things couldn't happen also because whether there were laws or rules, and now those are changed. So how do we want to create the new rules? Right? How do we
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
advocate differently um, than where our ancestors could have advocated or
Yeah,
supported?
because
Yeah.
of of the limitations of the times, and that we
Yep.
don't need to carry those limitations.
Yes. Again,
Yes.
let's unpack our backpack, ladies.
Yeah, let's do it.
I'm
So,
sure if we just said, what is one thing to sit with that you're now realizing from this conversation that you actually may have been carrying, that
yeah,
you didn't connect the dots to? That's the liberation, is awareness is the first step, right?
that is our wish for our listeners.
Mhm.
Indeed, indeed. I would like to, since we're both highly sensitive people, to
Mhm.
spend a very short amount of time on on explaining why this is even, I would say, even more relevant for highly sensitive people, because we tend to have such deep emotionality, and getting lost in context. I call that getting lost in rabbit holes. So we have this propensity to grieve deeper, to be aware of even more connections that are missing. We are so aware of, like you said, how your body reacted to wanting to call your mother, and then
Yeah.
realizing that person is not there, and then creates a whole pattern of things that are missing.
Yeah.
um so what's your take on that? Is it your experience that people that are of, carry that trait of high sensitivity, um, actually grieve in a different way, or a deeper way, or a more complex way? What is your
Yeah, I would say
observation?
just the superpower of sensitivity, right? Of having perhaps more sensitivity or connection to the inside and outside world can make it feel overwhelming, I think, for individuals. And what I found is then that could lead to not wanting to feel, right? To separate from that because of the depth of those feelings. And so I do think that there is a depth component. And I
Mhm,
do find that if you have not worked through and seen your sensitivity as a superpower, it can create even more resistance from feeling from that perspective. And so many times when I work with clients is actually focusing on honoring how that sensitivity does serve them and will ultimately serve others when they are empowered in that sensitivity. And so doing things like body scans and connecting to what part feels aligned enough to feel into can start to then create more capacity. So that's the part that I do feel. And I do this with most clients. I do find though with the sensitivity, you might take a notch lower, right? Like let's start, because as you start to feel into it, as you start to feel empowered, as you start to be able to express those feelings, and again start to look at individuals that will honor the depth of your feelings, then it becomes, in my opinion, easier to feel into that. I find that you and I have even talked about what it, when we talk about emotions and things of that nature, a lot of times, again, I go back to language. If we haven't sat to really feel and find the words for things, that's also where it becomes overwhelming. So I always think of like a toddler who can't necessarily tell you all that's going on, right? And they're moving and they're shaking and they're crying. Well, we have little toddlers inside of us sometimes because we're not sure how to articulate the heart palpitations, and is that anger or sadness or grief or those types of things. So I think also just allowing ourselves to discover how we name those experiences also helps us work through them again, and then other people can support us. So that's another thing that I think is really important for those who are more sensitive in nature from that perspective. And then the other thing is using tools that I use a lot of visualization that
Mm.
helps sensitive individuals feel that they can create a barrier, right? That whether some have probably heard of the bubble visualization, where you visualize yourself in a bubble, that you're more protected and safe from some of the outside experiences. Or I used to do a Teflon meditation where things would just slide off of me so I wouldn't take them in. Um, but there's all these other techniques depending on the type of person you're working with, and a visualization or connection in that way is supportive. Then we may use some of those techniques as well, because that's what I find too. You might not have tools in your toolbox that help you work through those experiences.
Yeah, we certainly don't learn that. I think it should be something that's taught at school in
Yes.
kindergarten, possibly
There's
in
so many
kindergarten.
things that we should have been taught. Yes. So that's a whole nother podcast of
Yes,
all the
that's
things
another
now that we
podcast.
know,
Let's.
right? Deep breathing, diaphragm breathing, visualizing, connecting, yes, expressing our emotions. I mean, the emotion wheel I found as part of doing this work, right? Like, I'm like, I should have an emotion wheel. I have emotion cards that I've purchased. I'm like, these are things, yes, we should have had as young people. Again, that
Yeah,
helps us feel that we can fully articulate how how we're experiencing life, for sure.
yeah. We could come up with another podcast on that if you feel like
Yes, we
it.
could.
So this one is also, unfortunately, since I'm really enjoying myself, coming to its end. And my last question is always the same, and that is, what is it that I did not ask you that you think might be important for my listeners to know?
Mm. I would say, asking.
There's one thing we didn't cover. I'm sorry if I do
Okay, that's
interrupt
fine.
you. That if that would help,
Yes.
is that you had talked about community, the healing
Yes, that's where I was
part of
going.
community. And see, two brains, two
Yes,
happy
those
brains
spidey
thinking
senses.
alike.
Yes, I was trying to figure out how to articulate it, but yes, that was going to be, yes, please continue.
Yeah, so let me see, where you said that community heals, and you said that especially for grief, community is so
Mhm.
important.
Yes.
So, yes, we did want to talk about that. So, please go
Yes.
ahead.
Yeah, so I guess that question would be like, what can you do to help yourself with grief beyond, working one on one and things of the nature? I would say, yes, community is so important. So whether it's a sensitive person, or we're talking about grief, or any other component of your life that you feel, sometimes you may feel alone or don't have the tools to work through, community is so important. It's interesting. We're so connected by social media. I mean, that's how we were able to find each other, right? But sometimes we can get lost in that. And I find that being intentional of finding individuals that are like-hearted, like-minded, that are also looking for support, but also to support back. Um, we live in a world that sometimes we're not intentional. There are a lot of groups created, but community is literally communing, connecting, right?
Mm,
Feeling seen, loved, and heard. So I would invite individuals also to take inventory. Are
mm,
you connected to more people that feel like groups, or, that are maybe more surface level? Where are you finding community? And community doesn't need to be 15, 20 people. It could be 3 people, right? So that's something I do think. And again, I mentioned the like-minded and like-hearted. So you might be in a group of individuals that you don't resonate with. I invite you to keep seeking and searching those that you do, because that is how you build the courage to keep moving forward in the life that you desire, and get the support that you need long term.
amen to that.
It's the intentionality, and it's the inventory, because sometimes we're like, "Oh, I thought," but when you sit and you're like, Do I feel connected? Do I feel seen? Do I feel loved? Do I feel understood? If you have a no or maybe, by the way, I'll say this before we drop. Maybe is a no.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe means no. Okay. So this is one where it's yes or no. It's not a maybe, right? And so if you're finding more of that, yeah, just that's the action that you can take, is that's the part that you can own of not giving up, continuing to seek out, because those people are waiting for you and will welcome you with open heart and open hands.
Yes. Yes. I thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And yeah, let's plan a second one. Okay.
Yay. Thank you so much. I appreciate
Thank
you and all
you.
that you're doing in the world and the opportunity to share on your podcast today.
Thank you, Nicole.